There's another reason I love being here with labor. When I'm here, I know I'm with people who stand up for working families across this country. It's true. Even today, our work is uphill. The powerful interests fight us on every battlefield they can. Look at the increasing corporate capture of the federal courts. According to a recent study, listen to this one, the 5 conservative justices currently sitting on the United States Supreme Court are in the top 10 most pro-corporate justices in half a century. And Justices Alito and Roberts, are you ready, are number 1 and number 2, the most anti-consumer justices in this entire time. The Chamber of Commerce is now a major player in the Supreme Court, and its win rate has risen to 70% of all the cases it supports. Think about this. You follow this pro-corporate trend to its logical conclusion, and sooner or later, you'll end up with a Supreme Court that functions as a wholly owned subsidiary of big business. Look at where we are on too big to fail. 5 years ago, experts said the banks have to be bailed out because there's too much concentration in banking, and the failure of one would bring down the entire economy. Now, the 4 biggest banks are 30% bigger than they were 5 years ago. I want to ask a question about supervising big banks when they break the law. If they can break the law and drag in billions in profits and then turn around and settle paying out of those profits, they don't have much incentive to follow the law. It's also the case that every time there's a settlement and not a trial, it means that we didn't have those days and days and days of testimony about what those financial institutions had been up to. Tell me a little bit about the last few times you've taken the biggest financial institutions on Wall Street all the way to a trial. Anybody? Chairman Curry?
To offer my perspective
sure.
as a bank supervisor, we primarily view the tools that we have as mechanisms for correcting deficiencies. So the primary motive for our enforcement actions is really to identify the problem and then demand a solution to it on an ongoing basis.
That's right. And then you set a price for that. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to move this along. That's effectively a settlement. And what I'm asking is, when did you last take, and I know you haven't been there forever, so I'm really asking about the OCC, a large financial institution, a Wall Street bank, to trial?
Institutions I supervise, national banks and federal thrifts, we've actually had a fairly fair number of consent orders. We do not have to bring people to in a trial or an
Well, I appreciate that you say you don't have to bring them to trial. My question is, when did you bring them to trial?
We have not had to do it as a practical matter to achieve our supervisory goals.
Ms. Walter?
Thank you, Senator. As you know, among our remedies are penalties, but the penalties we can get are limited, and we actually have asked for additional authority, my predecessor did, to raise penalties. When we look at these issues, and we truly believe that we have a very vigorous enforcement program, we look at the distinction between what we could get if we go to trial and what we could get if we don't.
I appreciate that. That's what everybody does. And so the question I'm really asking is, can you identify when you last took the Wall Street banks to trial?
I will have to get back to you with the specific information, but we do litigate, and we do have settlements that are either rejected by the Commission or not put forward for approval.
We've got multiple people here. Anyone else want to tell me about the last time you took a Wall Street bank to trial? You know, I just want to note on this. There are district attorneys and U.S. attorneys who are out there every day squeezing ordinary citizens on sometimes very thin grounds and taking them to trial in order to make an example, as they put it. I'm really concerned that too big to fail has become too big for trial. That just seems wrong to me.
Vulture funds are no longer just targeting third world countries. Eurozone nations like Greece and Ireland could be next.
How is a fund like that able to wield that sort of power?
So the background to the Argentina case is that through the 1990s, a huge debt had built up, some of it historic from a horrendous dictatorship in the 1970s, and some from horrible economic policies that were followed in line with what the IMF wanted. And the country entered a huge recession burdened by these debt payments. And then eventually the government felt it just had to default. It was unable to pay. And Argentina, since that default, its economy has been improving, and they reached an agreement with most of their creditors to pay off about 1/3 of the debt. But these vulture funds who buy up the debt when the country is in trouble for a very cheap price, and then they hold out, refuse to take part in that agreement, and they're suing for 100% of the value later on. So they're trying to make this exorbitant profit on loans that they never lent, and they pursue countries all across the world. So they're in Ghana because this Argentinian ship just happened to dock there.
And what about international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank? What role can they play in all of this?
Well, I mean, the IMF in many ways helps to facilitate this, because their role in these debt crises is that they bail out the lenders. They give new loans to countries to pay off these debts, which really are unpayable.
Si no le pagamos a los buitres, la sentencia dice que no le podemos pagar a nuestros bonistas. Y si sí le pagamos a los buitres, se nos desencadena una cantidad de recursos que deberíamos pagar que es impagable y que no sabemos dónde termina. De forma tal que la sentencia de Griesa, por un lado o por el otro, parece empujarnos al default. O sea, porque no nos deja pagar a los acreedores nuestros de los bonos reestructurados, o sea, por el contrario, porque le pagamos a los buitres, nos deja pagar a los reestructurados, pero vienen reclamos por sumas multimillonarias después de esto. Esto es lo que se desprende de la sentencia de Griesa. No dice absolutamente nada más. ¿Qué va a hacer el gobierno argentino? En primer lugar, no podemos permitir que nos impidan honrar nuestros compromisos con los acreedores, con los bonistas que entraron a la reestructuración, con nuestro 93% que está cobrando, que aceptó la quita y que ha cobrado puntualmente y que tiene sus bonos en su poder. Así que no vamos a permitir que nos impidan pagarles. Es por eso que estamos iniciando los pasos para realizar un canje de deuda para pagarla en Argentina y bajo ley argentina. Estamos iniciando los pasos. Pero, y quiero comentar otro punto, esto es lo que dice la sentencia de Griesa, lo que acabo de describir. Si una sentencia nos dice suicídense, nosotros no podemos, aunque querramos, responsablemente, ciegamente, aceptar eso que dice. Lo que debe quedar muy claro a todos los argentinos es que el gobierno no tomó esta deuda, no defaultó esta deuda, sino que ha tenido principios férreos que tienen que ver con que la capacidad de pago de la Argentina es aquella que nos permite seguir creciendo. No podemos nuevamente estar en una situación donde por pagar la deuda lo que reina en la Argentina es el hambre, el desempleo, la miseria.
Welcome to Liberia in West Africa, where 80% of the people survive on less than $1 a day.
Now, these people are being told that they have to pay $28 million to a bunch of financial speculators known as vulture funds. This was not supposed to happen.
So how did these American speculators get their hands on Liberia's debts?
We've come to the offices of Greylock Capital, big players in the industry.
Greylock CEO Hans Humes tells us how he ended up with some of Liberia's debts.
I ended up buying a lot of the loans that we had in Liberia. When I called one of the banks that was going through a merger 13, 14 years ago. And I said, hey, by the way, you're a lender to this African country. And the guy said, no, I'm not. A couple days later, he said, you know what, you're right. We found this box in this warehouse that had files for all these loans. Do you want to buy all of them?
The reason Hans and other speculators were able to buy up Liberia's debt dirt cheap was war. In the 80s and 90s, Liberian warlords were chopping the country into bloody pieces, killing 1 in 10 Liberians. Humes and others were willing to wait until peace could be restored, but for some vultures, Liberia's misery was an opportunity.
4,500 miles away from the mayhem, they file a lawsuit in this courthouse in New York City. Now, Liberia didn't really have a government. It was run by a bunch of warlords under UN sanctions. Not surprisingly, Liberia doesn't show up in the courthouse, and they lose automatically.
Who is behind this lawsuit?
The key figure is Eric Herman, the owner of vulture fund FH International.
In 2007, all of Liberia's creditors, including Eric Herman, agreed to accept just 3 cents on the dollar for all that nation's debts.
Then it emerged that Eric Herman had quietly transferred his part of the debt to a secretive fund called HAMSA.
Under the 3-cent deal, Herman would have received $1 million. But now, HAMSA sued in London for more. And that's how Liberia ended up getting hit with this $28 million judgment. Today, with the end of war, things are looking up for Liberia. There's a surge in literacy. Hopes are rising. But it's all threatened by lawsuits by vultures. The president has a message for them.
Look, here's a country having 2 decades of turmoil, of death and destruction, now trying to find its way back, trying to give its young people a future. You should not be the one to become an obstacle towards the achievement of this. Have a conscience and give this country a break.
Income inequality has been ticking up.
I think it's about envy. I think it's about class warfare.
It's class warfare, and it's the kind of language that you would expect from a leader of a third world country, not the President of the United States.
It's true, because the United States of America is not a third world country by any measure, except perhaps income inequality, where we rank worse than the Ivory Coast, worse than Cameroon, 64th, in your face, Uruguay, Jamaica, and Uganda. Yeah.
Last year we made $36,000, and we're a family of 3.
I think I probably make it between $45,000 and $50,000 a year, working 70 hours a week, 6 days a week.
Combined income with the Army and with my personal job, maybe $55,000 to $60,000 a year.
Probably close to $600,000.
Usually more than 10 million, less than 30 million. But, you know, a lot, a ridiculous amount of money. I am an entrepreneur and venture capitalist. My family owns a large manufacturer of bed pillows and down comforters called Pacific Coast Feather Company. We are, in fact, one of the largest manufacturers of those things in the world. The problem with rising inequality is a person like me who earns 1,000 times as much as the typical American doesn't buy 1,000 pillows a year. Even the richest people only sleep on 1 or 2 pillows. The pillow business is quite tough, as it is for many, many industries, because fewer and fewer people can afford to buy the products that we make. I have the nicest Audi you can get, but it's still only 1 Audi.
And the problem isn't that the rich spend too much of what they earn. It's actually, paradoxically, that they spend too little. They're not generating enough economic activity. Somebody earning $10 million a year doesn't spend $10 million. They save it. And those savings go anywhere around the world they can make the most money, get the highest return. They become part of the global capital market. including a lot of speculative instruments. I mean, gold and real estate and anything else that they're all chasing.
With the exception of the money I personally invest to start companies, I have essentially no idea what happens to my money. I invest in funds of funds, and those hedge funds do God knows what with it. But I do believe absolutely that most of the return that's being created isn't creating any kind of social utility other than creating a return for me.
And ordinarily, we like saving. I mean, savings are good, but when we have so much unemployment, so much underutilized capacity here in the United States, we need spending.